In the stillness of November 22nd, 1286, Denmark's king lay asleep inside a humble house near Finderup Church. Then, footsteps in the dark, steel unsheathed, hatred breathing heavy. When dawn came, his body bore 56 stab wounds, not felled in battle, not lost to sickness, but butchered in his bed by the very nobles sworn to protect him. This is the brutal end of Erik V of Denmark, a ruler devoured by his own ambition and betrayed in silence. Erik V of Denmark was born in 1249, a fragile child thrust into a world already trembling with unrest. His father, King Christopher I, died suddenly in 1259, leaving a throne without stability and a kingdom fractured by noble ambition. At only 10 years old, Erik was crowned king, but the ceremony was less a celebration of continuity than a desperate attempt to hold Denmark together. The boy who wore the crown was not yet a ruler in truth. He could not command armies, negotiate treaties, or even defend his own legitimacy. Instead, Denmark's fragile hopes rested on the regency of his mother, Queen Margaret Sambiria, a woman as fierce as she was isolated. She stood in the halls of power as both shield and target, protecting her son's inheritance while contending with noble families that smelled blood in the water. The atmosphere of Erik's childhood was defined not by stability, but by constant siege. Nobles disputed his father's legacy, bishops questioned the monarchy's reach, and neighboring rulers watched closely, eager to take advantage of Denmark's weakness. What should have been years of education and growth for a young prince became a crucible of politics and distrust. Erik's early reign foreshadowed the struggles to come. The Danish crown, once strong under previous kings, had become fragile, balanced on the will of nobles unwilling to yield and a queen fighting to keep her son's throne intact. The boy was king in name, but in practice, he was a pawn in battles far older and larger than himself. It was within this furnace of regency and resistance that Erik's character began to form. A child marked not by innocence, but by the weight of ambition deferred. By the time he would claim power for himself, the young monarch would already be scarred by years of noble defiance and clerical manipulation. His childhood was not a beginning. It was a warning of the bloody fate that awaited him. Queen Margaret Sambiria was no passive regent. In Erik's name, she ruled with a determination that made her both feared and despised. Her policies were ruthless, designed not only to preserve the throne, but to ensure that her son would one day inherit a crown still worth wearing. She forged alliances abroad, fortified castles, and tightened the monarchy's grip wherever possible. Yet every act of control was perceived by the nobility as provocation. The regency years became a battlefield of parchment and steel. Margaret sought to elevate royal authority above that of the aristocracy, but the lords of Denmark had grown accustomed to autonomy. They resisted her decrees, challenged her claims, and built their own networks of power. For every concession she made, new enemies emerged. Erik grew up in this storm of resentment, watching his mother fight to keep the monarchy alive. He was shaped less by tutors than by the sight of his mother's struggles, her iron will, her ceaseless conflicts, her defiance of those who wanted to strip the throne bare. But what the boy absorbed was not merely resilience. He also learned bitterness, the deep hostility between crown and nobility that would later define his own reign. By the time Margaret's regency waned and Erik began to rule on his own, the damage had been done. The nobles did not see him as a rightful king, but as the extension of his mother's tyranny. Where she had once fought for survival, Erik would continue the fight for dominance. And where she had made enemies, he would inherit them. The shadow of Margaret Sambiria never truly left him. To the aristocracy, Eric was her son before he was their king. A young monarch molded in the image of a woman they despised. That shadow, long and unyielding, ensured that when Eric finally seized power for himself, he would already be seen as a rival, not a ruler. When Eric finally stepped into his own authority, he carried the scars of his childhood and the lessons of his mother's iron regency. He had seen nobles undermine the throne, priests challenge royal decrees, and foreign rulers sniff opportunity in Denmark's weakness. For Eric, kingship was not a gift to be shared, but a weapon to be sharpened. He began by pushing for stronger royal control, determined to restore the monarchy his father had left behind. Taxes were raised, privileges curtailed, and royal influence forced into territories that nobles had long considered their own. The boy who once stood behind his mother now sought to rule as a man, unyielding and uncompromising. But ambition, when pressed against entrenched power, ignites sparks. The Danish aristocracy, hardened by years of autonomy, recoiled at Eric's demands. They saw not the rightful authority of a king, but the overreach of a ruler blind to balance. His policies, instead of unifying the realm, drove deeper divisions into its heart. Eric's court became a theater of tension. Every banquet, every council meeting carried undercurrents of suspicion. Nobles whispered in corners, priests muttered in cloisters, and farmers groaned beneath new levies. The young king, determined to stand tall, found himself increasingly isolated. His vision of an absolute monarchy clashed with the reality of a kingdom already fractured. Ambition made him bold, but boldness made him reckless. Rather than compromise, Eric doubled down, pressing harder, demanding more, and punishing resistance with severity. He believed strength would earn him loyalty. Instead, it bred defiance. Denmark, once trembling under his mother's regency, now trembled under a different shadow. That of a king whose hunger for power had begun to consume his crown. The breaking point came in 1282. By then, noble discontent had hardened into rebellion, a resistance too strong for Eric to crush. Surrounded by opposition and facing the collapse of his authority, he was forced into an act no medieval monarch ever desired. He signed away part of his own power. The document became known as the Charter of Kalundborg, remembered as Denmark's first constitution. To the nobles, it was a triumph. With ink and parchment, they had bound their king, setting limits on taxation, justice, and royal interference. It was more than a political contract. It was a declaration that the aristocracy would no longer be silent subjects, but co-rulers in the kingdom's fate. For Eric, the charter was a humiliation carved into history. He signed not with grace, but with clenched fists, the wax seal pressed under protest. In that moment, he saw not compromise, but chains, an admission that his authority had been shackled by those meant to serve him. Whispers spread quickly. In noble halls, the charter was celebrated as victory. In taverns, it was retold as proof that even a king could be forced to kneel. But in the king's heart, it planted a seed of vengeance. Eric resolved that one day he would tear up the parchment, reclaim his power, and remind Denmark that a crown was not meant to be shared. Yet history would not bend so easily. The signing of the Charter of Kalundborg marked a turning point not only in Eric's reign, but in the very balance of medieval Denmark. It exposed a kingdom where the throne no longer stood above all, and it set in motion a chain of defiance that would ultimately lead to the king's blood soaking the floor of Finderup. The downfall of a monarch is rarely written in single strokes. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a name, a rumor that grows louder with each telling. For Eric Fee, that whisper was clipping, the clipper. The story spread that he had ordered coins to be clipped, trimming away the edges to extract silver while keeping the currency in circulation. Whether true or not, it hardly mattered. The nobles seized on the accusation, and the people repeated it until it became legend. In medieval Denmark, trust was fragile, and money was sacred. A king accused of debasing coinage was seen not only as greedy, but as treacherous. Taverns echoed with bitter jokes. Merchants muttered curses as they weighed coins on their scales. Even farmers, far from royal courts, heard the insult whispered as if it were a curse carried by the wind. Erik had sought to strengthen the monarchy, but instead he found his name reduced to a slur. To be called clipping was more than an insult. It was a branding, a mark that stripped dignity from the crown itself. Kings are remembered for justice, conquest, or wisdom. Erik, increasingly, was remembered as a fraudster, a man whose ambition was matched only by deceit. The insult gnawed at him, feeding the bitterness already lodged in his heart. Each repetition of clipping reminded him that his enemies had not only bound his authority with parchment, but now shredded his reputation with words. In politics, perception often matters more than truth. And in the Denmark of the late 13th century, perception had become Erik's gravest enemy. The king could bear swords and raise armies, but he could not silence a name whispered in every hall and marketplace. His crown grew heavier, not from gold, but from shame. Each clipped syllable a dagger aimed at his legacy. By the mid-1280s, Denmark was a kingdom splintered on every front. The church resented Erik's encroachment on clerical privileges. Nobles, emboldened by the Charter of Kalundborg, despised his attempts to claw back authority. Farmers grumbled under heavy taxes, blaming the king for empty granaries and lighter purses. Erik stood at the center of this storm, defiant and unyielding. He believed that compromise was weakness and that yielding even an inch would destroy the monarchy. So he pushed harder, seizing lands, defying agreements, punishing defiance with severity. What he saw as strength, others saw as tyranny. Court life grew tense, every hall thick with suspicion. Nobles attended councils not to serve, but to conspire. Priests whispered sermons that skirted dangerously close to sedition. In villages, resentment brewed like slow poison. Erik wore the crown, but it no longer carried loyalty. It carried only distrust. That distrust was deadly. In the brutal calculus of medieval politics, a king without trust was a king already doomed. Nobles might bend before strength, but they would not tolerate humiliation. And Erik's relentless drive to assert his will left them with a single conclusion. If he could not be controlled, he must be removed. Plots began to form in shadows. Alliances forged in candlelit chambers. The monarchy was not simply weakened, it was surrounded. And the king, proud and resolute, seemed blind to the blades being sharpened in silence. By refusing to bend, Erik had become the architect of his own peril. His ambition to rule as his ancestors had left him isolated, surrounded not by allies, but by enemies waiting for their moment. In a realm already fractured, his defiance was the spark. The fire that would consume him was already lit. The night of November 20, 1286 unfolded with deceptive calm. Erik V, traveling through Jutland, had chosen to stop near the modest church at Finderup. It was not the grand halls of Copenhagen or the safety of fortified castles, but a simple house, a place where a king might rest without ceremony. The journey had wearied him, and the darkness outside seemed ordinary, almost gentle. But in medieval politics, the most ordinary nights could conceal the deadliest designs. As Erik lay down to sleep, a band of nobles gathered in silence. They carried not banners, but blades, their armor muffled, their steps deliberate. To them, this was not simply murder, it was justice. Each man had grievances, lost lands, wounded pride, broken promises. The king who had clipped coins and clipped their power had finally left himself exposed. The small house near the church became a stage for betrayal. No guards strong enough to resist, no walls thick enough to protect. Only flickering candlelight and the shallow breath of a king believing he had a few hours of peace. When the assassins reached the door, their hearts did not falter. This was no sudden outburst of rage. It was a decision sharpened over months, perhaps years, of conspiracy. The kingdom's future would be redrawn in blood. And so, in that quiet Danish village, as church bells stood silent and the night cloaked itself in stillness, the fate of a monarch was sealed. The crown of Denmark would not fall in battle, nor dissolve in diplomacy. It would be carved apart in the shadows, one stab at a time. The attack came swiftly, like a storm breaking through the night. The door was forced, the silence shattered. The king awoke not to warning, but to steel glinting in the dim light. Surrounded, Eric V had no chance to rise, no words to summon defense or mercy. Knives and swords rained down with ruthless precision. Blow after blow, cut after cut, until the assault became less a killing and more a frenzy. 56 wounds marked his body when it was over. Each stab was a statement, each cut a signature of vengeance. They were not content with death alone. They wanted desecration, a message written into flesh. By dawn, the bedchamber resembled not a royal lodging, but a slaughterhouse, the floorboards stained with the lifeblood of a king. Outside, the village slept unaware, the church's shadow stretching over a crime that would shake Christendom. A monarch had not been defeated in war or toppled by foreign invasion. He had been butchered in his sleep, abandoned by loyalty, undone by his own ambition. The assassins slipped back into the night, leaving behind not only a corpse, but a void. Denmark no longer had a ruler, only a story, a tale of betrayal, whispered with fear and fascination. For centuries to come, Finderup would be remembered not for its church or its quiet fields, but for the place where a king's reign ended in silence and steel. The number 56 would echo through chronicles, a chilling measure of noble hatred and the fragility of power. Eric Klipping's body lay still, but his wounds spoke louder than any decree he had ever signed. They told the world that crowns are fragile, kings are mortal, and betrayal is sharper than any blade. The morning after Eric V's assassination, Denmark awoke to shock. Word spread quickly. Their king had been slaughtered in his bed, not by foreign swords, but by the very nobles sworn to serve him. It was an act of regicide that shook not just Denmark, but the wider Christian world. The accused conspirators were many, powerful men whose names carried weight in the kingdom. Some fled into exile, others faced accusations and punishments. But none could erase the fact that the monarchy had been torn open from within. Trust between the crown and the aristocracy, already fragile, was shattered beyond repair. Finderup, once an unremarkable village, became infamous. To ordinary people, it was a place cursed, where the blood of a king stained the earth. To chroniclers, it became a symbol of Denmark's instability. A kingdom that murdered its monarch in the shadows could hardly claim unity or divine favor. Eric's son, Eric VI, ascended the throne, but the boy's inheritance was poisoned. He wore the crown, but it was a crown haunted by his father's fate. Every step he took was shadowed by whispers of betrayal. Every decree measured against the blood-soaked memory of Finderup. The cycle of conflict between monarch and nobility did not end. It deepened. In the halls of Europe, kings and princes took note. If Denmark could butcher its ruler in his sleep, what did that say about the sanctity of kingship itself? For a medieval world built on the belief that monarchs were chosen by God, Erik V's murder was a wound to the very idea of divine order. And so, the legacy of Finderup was not only Denmark's to bear. It echoed across Christendom, a reminder that even the mightiest crowns rested on fragile foundations, and that treachery, once unleashed, leaves scars no parchment can heal. Erik V's life was defined by conflict. A boy king raised in shadows, a ruler scarred by ambition, a monarch undone by betrayal. His death, carved into his body by 56 wounds, was not just the end of a man, but the confirmation of a truth Denmark could no longer deny: that the throne was no longer absolute. The Charter of Kalundborg, signed under duress, remained as much a part of his legacy as the blood spilled at Finderup. Ink and parchment had bound him in life. Steel and betrayal had ended him in death. Together, they told a story of power's fragility, of authority balanced on the knife's edge between crown and nobility. History remembers him not as a conqueror or a just ruler, but as Erik Klipping, the Clipper, a name of ridicule, a symbol of mistrust. Yet behind the slur lies the tragedy of a king who tried to wrest back power from nobles who had tasted independence, and who paid for that defiance with his life. The 56 wounds remain a grim tally, each one a testament to vengeance, each one a scar etched into Denmark's memory. They remind us that medieval politics was not merely negotiation or ceremony. It was survival, often decided in silence and steel. Erik's story endures because it speaks to a larger truth. Power, when stretched too far, invites resistance. Authority, when imposed without trust, breeds rebellion. And ambition, when unchecked, can carve not only kingdoms, but their rulers into ruin. The brutal end of Erik the Vime of Denmark stands as a warning carved in both parchment and blood. Crowns are fragile, loyalty is fleeting, and history remembers not just how kings lived, but how they died.